be agreed to.
Mr Speaker.
I call the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, if I can begin, as the Minister did, by acknowledging the work done by the men and women of the New Zealand Defence Force. I had the privilege of working with them over 9 years as a Minister in deployments in all parts of the world. I have the greatest respect for their efficiency, for their courage, for the way they carry out their operations, and they do this all on a very tight budget, Mr Speaker. We're a small country and we made hard decisions when we were in government about what we could sustain and what we couldn't. There's no talk in this bill about an air combat force, for example. They made a lot of fuss in the National Party about the abolition of it, but they never talked about bringing it back. I have the greatest respect for the Defence Force, but, you know, the one word that I didn't hear in the Minister's introduction of this bill was what the bill was really about. And that's a three-letter word. It's called cut, or cuts, actually, in the plural. Because what this bill is about, Mr Speaker, is what we learn in the briefing to the incoming Minister of Defence, Mr Coleman. The Cabinet, Doctor, if he prefers, if he stands on his title, but Maestro to some for his extraordinary performance in the Mount Albert by-election. But I want to come back to what the Minister did not talk about, Mr Chairman.
Order. Interjections are not to be between members. They're at the Speaker. And we have two members here interjecting on each other. Call the Honourable Phil Goff.
The briefing to the incoming Minister gives it away, and I just want to read one sentence. Cabinet has directed an annual recurring savings target for the New Zealand Defence Force of $350 to $400 million by 2015. What this bill is about, and what the intention of the government is, Mr Speaker, is to cut $400 million a year from the Defence Force. And you can't, Minister, talk out of both sides of your mouth by talking about respect for the Defence Force, their sacrifice, the risk they put themselves under, and at the same time pull the rug out from under the Defence Force by slashing expenditure by $400 million a year. And elsewhere, of course, in this briefing for the incoming Minister, it refers to the Territorial Force, which is also included in this bill. And what does it say about that? They're going to cut it by a third. Cut the Territorial Force by a third. 600 people are going to be down the road in the Territorial Force. And I want to say this about that aspect to the Minister. Since 2000, more than 1,000 of the Territorial Force have served this country overseas in war zones in deployments. But for the Territorial Force, the regular force would have been under real pressure. And forget what this bill says about the Territorial Force. It's what the government is doing to it that counts, and they're gutting it by slashing it by a third. A third, Mr Speaker.
Point of order, the Honourable Minister Jonathan Coleman.
Mr Speaker, this is all very interesting, Mr Goff's opinions here, but a first reading speech is meant to be about the content of the bill, and we're not really hearing any of that.
Well, no, I don't need any help. The reality is that the member, of course, is entitled to have some form of rebuttal. He's coming to the end of that now, and I'm sure that he's coming to the point of the bill. Point of order, the Honourable Clayton Cosgrove.
With respect, sir, a major thrust of this bill is about a thing called capability management. And I think everything that my colleague Mr Goff has said has been very germane to that theme. If the Minister doesn't know his own bill, he should read it.
Thank you for your contribution. I call the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, the bill is indeed about lifting the capacity and the capability of the Defence Force. And what I'm saying is you've got meaningless clauses in this bill renaming the Territorial Forces the Reserve Forces, but what's really happening about capability and capacity is that they're gutting it by cutting it by two-thirds, by a third, Mr Speaker. 600 people down the road. I want to ask the Minister, what does this bill do to sustain regular forces if we increase our deployments overseas, when you need to call on territorial forces to back it up if he's going to cut the territorial forces by a third, renaming them the Reserve Force is just an exercise in hypocrisy. They won't be there as a reserve force. A third of them will be down the road. And interestingly, it'll be the areas of the country...
Point of order, the Honourable Minister Jonathan Coleman.
The member knows you can't use the H word in here.
Yeah, actually, I was about to raise, the member's quite right, you cannot use the H word here. I call the Honourable Phil Goff.
Point of order, Mr Speaker. I wasn't calling the Minister a hypocrite. I was saying that the bill was an exercise in hypocrisy, and that is within standing orders, sir.
Well, the thing is that, as a Speaker, one has to look at the content and the atmosphere in the House at the time. If it's going to lead to disorder, then one has to be careful in the way in which they use it. I call the Honourable Phil Goff.
Mr Speaker, everything about this bill, every area that is covered in the bill, the government is making taking retrogressive actions to damage the capability of the Defence Force. I've talked about the territorial force, sir. I could talk about the military bands. You know, they're going to save $900,000 by slashing 7 out of 10 of the military bands. That's the same amount that they were planning to spend on a flash swimming pool in Tokyo, Mr Speaker. And I've got to say that it's far more important to me that on Anzac Day this year than when we turn up at the parades, that the 7 bands that are going to be disbanded will still be there but playing for the last time. And I ask the Minister why it is that his actions are going to lead to 7 out of 10 of those military bands being disbanded. Who will be playing on Anzac Day? Who will be out there on Armistice Day? Who will be there on the commemorative ceremonies that are required for us to celebrate the Defence Force that he talks so much about and their sacrifice? Who will be there to stand up and remember that by providing the military bands that accompany those parades? And I say that's the wrong thing. And of course the bill is also about civilianisation. Well, that's another word for redundancy, Mr Speaker. There are 500 redundancies that have occurred in the last year in the Defence Force, and 2/3 of those are uniformed people. And I ask the Minister this: in the process of civilianisation, how is it that I hear of uniformed people who have been made redundant in high positions and end up in the same position with the same salary and back in uniform after they've got their redundancy money? And I ask the Minister, is that happening? And what is he doing about that? Because that is a wastage of money when supposedly what the government is trying to do is save money. You know, the only people that have made money out of the Defence Review and the White Paper are the expensive consultants that the Minister has employed. Rod Dean, the former Telecom chief, very well paid for his job, but what does he know about the military? And there's some outfit called the Pacific Road Corporate Finance. They made a lot of money, but what this bill and what the government's actions have been about has been about undermining the military by cutting the funding of it. And I want to say that when the then Chief of Defence Force described the outcome of the Defence Review as challenging, that's Lieutenant General Jerry Mataparai. Anybody that knows the Defence Force and the Civil Service knows that the word challenging means what public servants say when they think that the government is halfway to la-la land. And that's what Jerry Mataparai said about it. Mr Speaker, what they haven't done is actually make the cuts that should have been made. Why is the Minister spending $400 to $700 million on upgrading the air defence missile systems when the only purpose of that is to allow the frigates to be up in the Gulf for maybe a month every 2 years and to perhaps please the United States? I say to this Minister, instead of cutting the defence personnel, instead of undermining the morale of that organisation, cut where you can afford to cut on the nice-to-haves. And it's a reflection on this government that in the latest Defence Review survey of opinion, it shows the Defence Force morale at the lowest level since the survey began. The lowest level since the survey began. 15 1,200 people have quit the Defence Force in the last 12 months. This in the midst of the government's recession. That shows you what the morale of the Defence Force is. And there is nothing, Mr Speaker, in this bill that addresses that question. Having a good Defence Force is essential to New Zealand. Thank God for a Labour government that put the money into the capital acquisitions and building up the Defence Force. This bill is about cutting. This bill is about reducing capacity. This bill is about a government that talks big when it comes to the importance of defence, but doesn't back it up with action and the funding to provide an effective Defence Force and the equipment that is capable of serving the people who represent this country so proudly.
I call the honourable member John Hayes.